The freezing night wind cut through my coat when the stranger pressed a heavy, warm coin into my palm and whispered, "One day, this coin will show you where it truly belongs." His voice was tired, old in a way that didn't match his face. Then he disappeared into the crowd outside the soup kitchen before I could ask his name. I stared down at the coin of gold disc with an unfamiliar crest and tiny letters worn thin by time, and I remember thinking it was just a strange act of kindness. Months later, I realized it wasn't a gift at all. It was the first clue in a mystery that had been waiting for generations. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll know why the greatest treasure I found was never the fortune itself, but the reason it had been hidden in the first place. To understand why one ordinary coin changed the rest of my life, I have to take you back to quieter days. I'm a nun. I took my vows in a small convent tucked into a town most people only pass through on their way to somewhere bigger. We wake early for prayer. We make soup and bread. We visit the old. We teach children who can't afford tutors. And we keep the kind of promises that only matter if no one but God sees them kept. Before that night, I knew about need in a practical way: how to stretch beans, how to mend, how to make a child laugh with a paper crane. I also have this habit my sisters tease me for. I keep things, not fancy things. I keep scraps of history, a frayed ribbon with a name stitched into it, a train ticket from a soldier who asked me to pray for him, a broken locket with a faded photo. I believe every object carries a story if you're patient enough to listen. Our town is small but old, and it wears its history the way some people wear grief quietly, but it's there if you look. There are churches with stones polished by centuries of rain, abandoned estates with sun-bleached shutters and gardens trying to remember their shape, a forgotten library with a door that sticks in winter, a merchant district with crooked alleys and signs from businesses that closed before my parents were born. Near the river, there's a weathered bridge, older than any record in the municipal hall will admit, with carved symbols you only notice if you lean over too far. There are tunnels, too, filled in or bricked over, and legends about smugglers that I don't repeat because people confuse legends with permission. Our archives sit in a damp basement that smells like old paper and colder Januaries. And the families, some of them trace their names back so far they can tell you which ancestor laid the first brick of their house and which child still hides their great-grandfather's coin collection inside a tea tin. That night, after the stranger slipped the coin into my hand, I didn't take it to a jeweler or a bank. I took it to our little storeroom, to a crooked shelf where we keep a wooden box for meaningful things. I cleaned it gently with a dry cloth and a soft brush, humming the way I do when I can't decide if I'm nervous or excited. The coin was heavier than it looked, and the gold was a warm old gold, not bright, like it had learned to be quiet. On one side, there was a crest I didn't recognize, an anchor crossed with a lily, and behind them, a small, braided tree whose three roots twined together like a plait of hair. Around the edge were tiny letters I could barely make out with a magnifying glass, just hints of a phrase and faint notches I thought might be accidental, until I counted them and realized there were 7. I checked our local history books and coin guides. Nothing like it. No mention of that crest, no record of a guild with that mark. I went to bed with the coin under my pillow and a question in my chest that wouldn't let me sleep. I didn't think about fortune. I thought about caretaking. The man's words, "where it truly belongs," shook something inside me because I believe that about everything. Belonging is not a feeling, it's a responsibility. So I kept the coin quiet. I told only my superior, who smiled in that way she does when she thinks the Holy Spirit has a sense of humor, and said, "Be patient. If this coin has a story, it will tell you." Winter bled into spring. We ran out of socks and then found some behind the altar, the way we always do when we need what we can't buy. One morning, a man brought a weathered trunk to the convent, the kind with brass corners and a faded shipping label from a port that never existed on any modern map. He said his aunt had died and her attic needed to be cleared. The trunk smelled like cedar and coal smoke, and inside it were rolled-up paintings with chipped frames, hymnals in a language I don't speak, a cracked monocle, and at the very bottom, a stack of ledgers tied with blue ribbon. The ink had bled in the damp, but the handwriting was steady, practiced. I sat on the floor with the ledgers and a gentle light from the one good window and began to read. 2 pages in, my heart hammered. The cover said, Accounts of Root and Anchor, Year of the Gray Winter. Root and Anchor. It was impossible not to feel the hairs rise on my arms. It matched the coin, the braided tree, the anchor, the lily. Inside the ledger were columns of numbers I couldn't immediately decode, and notes in the margin that sounded less like accounting and more like pleas. Do not record names in full, one note read. Use initials, for safety. Another line. Tokens distributed to 12 guardians. Return upon need, not for profit. And this. A 7 to be held for the house of bread, to be claimed only by the bearer who serves without asking. I lifted the coin, heart beating hard, and caught my breath when I looked again at the rim through the magnifying glass. The tiny notches weren't accidental. Alongside them, barely there, was a 7. It wasn't pretty. It was scratched, like somebody had carved it with a pin. A 7. I whispered it like a prayer. I didn't run to the archives right away. I was afraid of breaking the spell, afraid of finding out I was unraveling a fairy tale I wanted too much to be true. Instead, I brought the trunk to the convent library and began a slow, careful reading. The ledger didn't name a bank, which struck me as odd. It referred instead to houses and hearths. House of Bread, Bridge House, River House. And on the last page, in a cramped hand, a line that curled into my heart like smoke. When the frost returns, let mercy choose the finder. I took the coin and the ledger to the Historical Society 3 days later. The director wasn't in. A historian who does consulting for collectors, Dr. Virginia Clove, happened to be there studying a map with so many water stains it looked like the river had tried to erase it. She measured the coin with a caliper and weighed it on a small brass scale. It's old, she said. Hand-hammered, but it's not like any of the standard guild tokens from around here. Could be from a merchant house that didn't want to be taxed. Could be an oath token, a pledge. She looked at me over her glasses. You sure you want to chase this? These things? People get greedy. Stories get twisted. And no one believes a nun didn't want to keep it. I smiled because she didn't know me yet. I'm not chasing anything, I said. It found me. The more I looked, the more the city seemed to be smudged with the root and anchor crest, like fingerprints I hadn't noticed. On the old stone bridge, tucked into the keystone, I found a faint carving of the braided tree. In the merchant district, where the shutters sag, there's a boarded-up building that used to be a bakery. Above the door, under 6 layers of paint, someone had once carved an anchor and a lily side by side. In the abandoned library, a first edition had a book plate with a tiny tree whose 3 roots wrapped around the author's name. I started a notebook, then another when the first filled up. I sketched the symbols, made lists of initials, cross-referenced names from the ledger with donations our convent logged during winter months over the last 50 years. Anonymous loaves, coats with no tags. And I kept seeing a 7. In the ledger. In the margin of a letter tucked into the trunk. On the spine of a thin journal with a broken clasp I found behind a stack of hymnals. That thin that journal broke me open. The first page said, Inventory of the Abandoned Monastery, Western Hill. I know the place. We sometimes collect herbs there. The journal listed lamp oil, linens, casks of grain, and then, as if the writer didn't want anyone to notice, box of 12, tokens of pledge. The writer signed each page with the initial I, Ilar, maybe, Ilario. At the back of the journal, in a simpler, gentler hand, a prayer that read like instructions baked into poetry. Hide not gold for the hungry, hide it from thieves. Bury not hope in earth, bury it in names. Bury it in names. I sat with that for days. I could feel the shape of the answer without knowing the word for it. I wrote to the municipal hall and asked for old property records related to any building known as a house of bread. A clerk named Nell Abbott wrote back and said there had been a house of bread 2 centuries ago, and that the property had passed, very quietly, into a charitable trust that stopped filing public reports when the trust's primary trustee died without heirs. She sent me a blurry copy of a note appended to the deed. See anchor provision, clause ember 12, words that sounded made up, like a fairy law, except they were in the careful hand of a lawyer who probably never wrote poetry in his life. Around that time, a man came to the convent asking to see me. He said he was a collector, Jonas Pike, and he'd heard we had a curious gold object worth some fine money. He smiled in that way people smile when they think you're naive. I told him he'd been misinformed. He left a card anyway, and later someone slipped a note under our door. Stop digging. The roots bite. I stared at the letter R. It looked like it had been practiced, the way you rehearse a signature you haven't used in a long time. That night I couldn't sleep, and I went to the storeroom and held the coin. I made a decision that sounds small but wasn't. I wouldn't show it to anyone else who came offering money. I would follow the story, not the price. I wasn't alone. Help came in quiet ways. The caretaker of an abandoned estate at the edge of town, Grey Mantle House, had grown used to me showing up with lists of things to photograph. Elias Rowan was his name. He wore the same gray cap winter and summer and always carried a ring of keys that clanged like a bell choir. He let me wander the library with a flashlight and a little dust mask and never hurried me. One afternoon, I found a painting of the river with the stone bridge in the background. In the corner, where an artist would sign, there was no name, just a braided tree with 3 roots, and beside it, a tiny set of letters barely visible under varnish. 3R-BH, Third River, Bridge House. When I pointed it out, Elias nodded like he knew a secret and then looked away like he'd promised not to say it out loud. I brought the painting to Dr. Clove, who scraped a test spot and said the varnish was old, the symbol genuine, and the letters likely a locator used by merchants, not artists. Third River Bridge House, she said, tapping the letters with the tip of a paintbrush. If it exists, it would be near the oldest section of the riverbank, west side. The bakery, maybe. My chest ached with a hopeful fear. I asked Nell at the municipal hall for any records of renovations at the old bakery. She sent me a permit for bricking up a basement hearth after a fire 60 years ago, along with a note in the margin of the permit that read, in a different ink, "Leave the box." I went with Nell and Dr. Clove to the bakery on a rainy Thursday. We pried open a side door that had been painted shut and waded through dust thick enough to taste. Behind the counter was a hearth, bricked over and black around the edges from that long-ago fire. In one corner of the hearth, a square of bricks had been mortared in with a slightly different sand. I touched it and felt how a story can feel like a pulse. We brought in a mason, who shook his head but agreed to help after I told him I was a nun, looking for a box left by people who might have fed his great-grandmother. Behind the bricks lay a tin box, scarred by heat but still whole. My hands trembled as I lifted it. Inside were letters sealed with a wax stamp, the braided tree, and a small bundle of deeds tied with thread. The first letter began, "To the bearer of token 7, who keeps her hands strong for bread and not for show." I will never forget the way those words felt, like someone had traveled time to pat my shoulder. The letters told a story so simple it didn't feel like a secret. During a winter the town used to call the Gray Winter, when disease and hunger came together the way bad things do, a circle of merchants and midwives and shipbuilders and teachers pooled their resources. They distrusted the officials who counted other people's money as if it were their own, so they created the Root and Anchor Benevolent. They minted tokens, 12 of them, marked A1 through A12, and placed each token with a guardian instructed to wait and watch. The money wasn't meant to vanish. It was meant to be patient. They hid it in deeds and shares and stocks and boxes because if they kept it in one place, someone cruel might have taken it all in one night. The tokens were not keys. They were compasses. A 7, one letter said in the lawyer's precise hand, corresponds to the House of Bread holdings and shall pass its right of claim to the bearer when that bearer is a servant of mercy with no claim for self. I brought the coins, the letters, and the deeds to a law office recommended by Nell. Small firm, dark wood, a partner with a quiet voice, and a copy of our town's founding charter on the wall. We read the letters together. He called a meeting with the county trust office, the office no one notices until a very old person dies without a will. The trust officer was cautious, suspicious even. She asked for proof the coin was authentic. Dr. Clove prepared a report with photographs of the edge marks, metal composition, and a comparison to a cut mark on one of the letters where wax had dripped. The pattern matched the coin's rim. The trust officer asked for proof I was who I said I was. I brought my superior, who kept her hands folded in her lap in that way that makes people tell the truth just to get warm. We signed affidavits. We brought witnesses. We told the story again and again until I could feel which parts made cynics lean in because they wanted not to believe. We followed Claw's Ember 12 through a chain of dusty documents that linked a defunct bank harbor and Rise savings to a box at the county repository, where the assets of unfound trusts sit like patient ghosts. Jonas Pike, the collector, tried to insert himself. He filed a nuisance claim, alleging the coin had been stolen from his family, that my order was exploiting a rumor for gain. It hurt. He'd come to our soup kitchen and pretended to be interested in our work while taking photos of the coin from my notes. The trust officer saw through him. The letters from the tin box named the Pikes as merchant rivals who had tried to undermine the root and anchor in court 2 centuries ago. I didn't enjoy that. I didn't want a villain. I wanted a clean story, kindness begetting kindness, but life insisted on including the complications that make kindness necessary. When the trust officer finally nodded and said, "We'll open the repository box," my breath went somewhere I couldn't go with it. The box was plain gray metal with a spray of numbers stenciled on it. Inside were things that looked like nothing until you read them. Certificates for shares in a shipping company that had quietly grown and merged and grown again. Deeds to a strip of riverfront whose rents had accumulated in an untouched account because the last listed tenant had been paying the wrong office for decades. Bonds issued by a hospital that had once served the poor for free and then turned privately funded, with a clause that sent dividends into a charitable account in perpetuity. A smaller metal case held old coins, gold and silver, cataloged in a tight hand and wrapped in cloth sewn with initials that matched the ledger from the trunk. On the bottom of the box lay an envelope, brittle with age, addressed, "To the sister who keeps warm bread in a cold winter." When I opened it, a paper lighter than air unfolded in my hands. "If you have found this," it read, "it is because you gave when you had little and asked for nothing when you could have asked for much. The assets you hold are not to enrich a name, least of all your own. They are to repair first what hunger breaks: bodies, minds, homes. Restore the house of bread as clinic and shelter. Restore the orphan rooms. Mend the river school. Finish what the gray winter taught us to begin." I sat with my head on the table and cried the way you cry when you realize the thing you thought you were looking for is smaller than what you were given. There was one piece left I hadn't understood: the stranger. Why me? Why that night? As we began the process of setting up a foundation root and anchor, not as a memory, but as a living promise, I went back to Greymantle House to thank Elias for his care and to return the painting. He made tea on a hot plate and poured it into thick mugs like a grandfather. He watched me with the gentlest attention, and then he said, almost shy, "Do you still have the coin?" "Yes," I said. "I'll never forget the night a stranger said, 'One day, this coin will show you where it truly belongs.'" He finished the sentence with me, word for word, and the room narrowed to a single point of sound. I looked at his hands. The left knuckle had a scar I'd seen that freezing night when the man pulled his glove off to press the coin into my palm. "It was you," I said, not angry, not hurt, just full. He nodded once and took off his cap. He looked older without it, which is a strange trick. "My mother cleaned the floors at Harbor and Rise," he said. "Her grandmother before her. For as long as anyone in my family could remember, someone kept watch at the edge of the money listening, delivering small help, keeping the names quiet. When the bank folded into the county, the last of the old guardians met in our kitchen and said there needed to be one person who chose the finder by watching, not by reading papers. They gave me the coin and told me not to rush. I watched a lot of people do good things for show. And then I saw you keep a little boy's drawing in your Bible so you wouldn't lose the prayer he asked you to say for his dad. I saw you bring back a wedding ring someone dropped in the soup line when you could have sold it to fix the boiler. You made a list of our dead by first name so we wouldn't forget them. I waited. I wanted to be sure. He took a folded note from his pocket. And I slipped that warning under your door, the one about roots biting. Not to scare you off, to scare off anyone watching you. I'm sorry for that. I took his hand. You trusted me, I said. You fulfilled a promise. He shrugged like it was nothing when it was everything. 2 weeks later, he came to the opening of the clinic we called the House of Bread, sat in the back, and told me his legs were tired. He never made it to the ribbon cutting. He died in his sleep that night, his keys on the table and his cap on a chair. I wish I could tell you there was a moment when I stood in a vault and blinked in the yellow glow of treasure. There was a small vault in the foundation of the old mill we restored blueprints had hinted at it, and a line in Agnes Merritt's diary, found later in a trunk we were given by her distant great-niece, had whispered, "Leave the salt room sealed until the river gives back what it took." Inside the vault were crates of coin and ledgers and 2 small paintings that turned out to be important. But the moment that took my breath wasn't numismatic. It was legal. It was reading the line in the trust that said, "All proceeds shall be spent within the life of the need." This wasn't a dragon's hoard, it was a living stream. We formed the Root and Anchor Foundation with a board that included families whose ancestors had given and families who had received. We set strict rules, no salaries above a teacher's, full audits posted in the library, the one with the sticky winter door. We restored the Stonebridge's keystone and cleaned the carving without erasing it. We reopened the House of Bread as a clinic that hands out warm meals in one wing and fills prescriptions in another. We established a scholarship in Elias Rowan's name for students who are the first in their families to study nursing or social work. We found a bigger space for the orphan rooms. No one calls them that now. They're family rooms where children wait between foster families and filled them with books and volunteers who show up. We fixed the orphanage roof on the outskirts of town where the wind slices through gaps. We funded a wing of the hospital that doesn't turn anyone away, and it bears no names except this: Root and Anchor. We didn't touch the coin. We placed it in a glass case in the clinic lobby with a small card that reads, "Token 7, entrusted to the bearer who serves without asking." People leave notes beside it. Sometimes the notes are thank yous. Sometimes they're promises. Sometimes they are prayers. Sometimes someone slips in a photo of a person who didn't make it through a winter and writes a first name and a date and nothing more, and I put it in a book so the names don't float away. I was changed, not by the money, but by the responsibility. I used to think wealth was a test you passed or failed, depending on whether you kept it. Now I know the real test is quieter and harder. It's whether you can bear the weight of other people's hope without making it about yourself. The stranger's sentence wasn't a riddle. It was a charge. One day, this coin will show you where it truly belongs. It belonged in the hands of a town that had once been brave enough to hide generosity from the greedy and to trust the future to pick the right hands when it was time to give it away. People ask me if I ever wanted to keep any of it. No, because from the first moment I held that coin, I felt watched in a good way. Not by people, though Elias was watching. By time. By the ones who set aside a little when they had every reason to keep it. By the midwife who sewed bank certificates into the hem of her apron, and the teacher who hid a share certificate in a geography book, and the dock worker who pretended not to know he was paying rent to a trust that would someday pay it back with interest to his great-grandchildren. I belong to them now. I feed who they told me to feed. I fix what they were too busy saving lives to fix. And in the quiet, when the clinic is closing, and the last bowl has been washed and the last light turned low, I touch the glass where the coin rests, and I say, "Thank you." Not for the fortune, for the trust. If you're still listening, here's what I want to leave you with. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden, not so one person can be made rich, but so a community can stay alive long enough to meet the person who'll use it wisely. Sometimes the most important part of a story is not the gold you find, but the hands you choose to place it in. I'm curious, what would you have done if a complete stranger had pressed that coin into your hand on a freezing night and vanished? Tell me in the comments because I read them and your answers matter. And if this ending changed how you think about true wealth, about what it means to keep and to give, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.